Hi, this is Debbie and Walter with Book and Bujo. Welcome here. Today I am going to go through my September wrap-up. We'll start with some stats. Alright, so in September, gotta look at my cheat sheet because I read so many, so I ended up reading 23 books and 7,024 pages. That just seems crazy to me. That was a lot. So that's an average of about 319 pages per book. So I did have some. I had 4 graphic novels that were only like 29 pages, but I also had a classic that was about just under 1,500 pages. So that was an average of about 234 pages a day. And for ratings, I had 0 1-star and 0 2-star, which is great. It's always nice when that happens. I did have 9 3-stars. I had 12 4-stars, and then I had 1 5-star book. For demographics, I had no children's books this month, which sometimes I do have some of those in there. So welcome to the Walter show here. He's taking over. I had read 8 young adult books, 1 new adult, and 14 adult books. And for format, I had read 2 short stories, and so one of those was like 32 pages. So again, I had quite a few small books. That's probably why I had so many that I read. I read 5 graphic novels and comics, and then 16 standard novel size books. For genres, I had 10 fantasy, 1 poetry, 2 classics, because I try and read at least 1 classic a month, 2 horror books, 2 mythology, which again is another favorite, 2 nonfiction, again I try and read at least 1 nonfiction every month, 1 contemporary, and 3 historical fictions. I also had 2 translated books, 1 from Polish and 1 from French. Sources, so I had 2 of them were from my own TBR books I already had. 1 I did haul, so I did purchase 1. And then 20 I borrowed from either the library or from Amazon, my 10 Amazon borrows, or the 4 of the graphic novels I did borrow from a friend. Alright, so time periods of the books were from 1843, I think I had an 1843 and an 1844, all the way up to 2022. So I had quite a big range of when the books were released. So I do have 1 of those 23 books. So 1 of them I have not quite finished yet. I got 80% of the way through, and I was listening to the audiobook, and then I didn't have the access to it anymore, and I'm waiting to be able to check it back out from my library so I can finish it off. But right now I think there's 7 people ahead of me, so it'll probably be a little while before I get a chance to finish that one, but hopefully I can get to that this month. Again, here's Walter. Say hi, Walter. So I listened to almost 165 hours worth of audiobooks. So I had 5 of my books were audiobooks, 6 were actually physical books, and then 12 were ebooks this month, which is kind of rare. I usually maybe have 1 physical book that I read every 2 or 3 months. So to have 6 in 1 month is pretty amazing, and only have 5 audiobooks. That's rare, because I usually try and do as many as possible as audiobooks. So please like, comment, and subscribe, and don't forget to hit that notification bell if you like what you're seeing. And now, the books. Okay, so for Bookoplathon, I started with The Black Cat, and that's by Edgar Allan Poe, and that was a short story, also considered horror in the horror genre. It was really interesting. I really liked it. It's a little bit different. I do like Edgar Allan Poe quite a bit. His books are a little bit different, but they're really interesting. Got me into the good spooky Halloween vibes. in September before we headed into actual spooky season. Next was Kings of the Wyld, and I did read that in a physical book that I got from my library, which I've of course returned already. And that's by Nicholas Eames, and it's the first book in the Band series. And that was for the Howling Pack Book Club. So Kings of the Wyld, it was wild. So it was really fun. It's like, so I kept getting Red and the Expendables vibes from the movies, where it's a bunch of old dudes that used to be really good at what they did, coming back out of retirement, and so now they're all, you know, senior citizens, and they're coming out and trying to do their thing again to rescue one of their band's daughter, which is fun in itself. But it's also kind of it had a really chill vibe, but there was a lot of action. So it's like they're trekking through the woods, they're fighting monsters, but yet all of their conversations and everything about them just felt kind of chill and laid back. So that was nice. But there was also a lot of music references from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So mainly kind of 70s in this book. There were some Elvis references and some other things like that. So that was kind of fun to pick up on, as I'm a child of those decades. It was fun to reminisce about some of those. So yeah, we're following Clay and the rest of his band as they're trying to save Gabe's daughter, who's the leader, or the front man for the band. And they're going through, they have to get to all of the different band members and get them all back. Then get through the woods, which are rife with monsters, and then get to the city that Gabe's daughter is in, to rescue her from the opposing army that is coming in to annihilate the town that she's in, or the city. I can see why some people would give this only 3 stars, although I gave it a 5-star, total 5-star read for me, because it was just so much fun. Just the vibes of it, the humor is just so sarcastic. I'm totally there for it. I love sarcastic and dark humor, and this book had that in every page. It was great. But I can see how some people might not like it. Not everybody's into the sarcastic humor. Not everybody gets some of that dry humor either. But yeah, it was great. Moog is probably one of my favorite characters. I just kept picturing Christopher Lloyd from Back to the Future, the Doctor, as that character. If this was a movie, I could see him playing him. Next up, I was The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. And this one, the copy I had was 1,493 pages, so that was a huge book. And that was for, oh, I forgot to mention, The Black Cat was for less than 300 pages, a small book for Becca's Bookathon. Kings of the Wyld was for people on the cover. And The Count of Monte Cristo was for Dice Roll Roulette, where I rolled a 12, and that was 575 plus pages. So The Count of Monte Cristo was great. So when I finished the book, I did watch the movie, and like I always do when I do it in that order, I'm like, that's not in the book. That's totally not what happens in the book. So I do kind of prefer watching the movies first, but regardless, the book was really good. It was really long. There were some times where it was a little confusing trying to remember who was who, because there was a lot of names. I think it would have been better if I had followed along in the ebook a little more often than I did. A lot of times I put an audiobook on and I do food prep and I clean the house and do laundry and that kind of thing, and so it makes it harder to sit and read along with it. And so at times it was like the main character goes by so many different names. He's Edmund, he's Sinbad, he's the Count, he's, you know, and he's got all these names, and you're like, wait, who are we talking about again? But then all the people around him, I feel like, have multiple names for some of the characters, and so it got a little confusing here and there, but overall, I really enjoyed it. Alexandre Dumas has really easy to read writing style, or at least the translations from the French are really easy to read. I've read, he also does The Three Musketeers, which is also a great book. So if you haven't read that one, I highly recommend that as well. Next up was Favorite Trope, and that is Goddess by Ednah Walters. This is number 7 in the Runes series, and I really enjoy this. It's total guilty pleasure type of read, but it's mythology based. You've got 3 kids in high school that are all kind of best friends that you follow throughout the different books. So you have Rain, who is the main character for the most part, and then you have Cora, who is her best friend, and then you have Eric, who is also kind of best friend, somewhat raised as a brother as well, because he spent a lot of time at her house growing up. And then you find out, so this is 7th in the series, so I can't say a whole lot without spoilers and stuff, but they're still all together. Goddess, we're following Cora's perspective, although we do get to see Rain and Eric in this story as well. Let's see, and then we had Emoji, which I got a bowl of food, and so I read Fast This Way by Dave Asprey. It was really good. So I've read quite a few books on how good fasting is for you, but none of them ever really give you like a detailed breakdown of how you should do it. Like, should you do it every day? Should you do it every once in a while? Like, what should you eat? What is fasting? So this book kind of breaks it down, so it's a little bit more for beginners. There is a lot of, this book follows Dave's journey as he's learning how to fast, and so he goes out into the middle of Sedona and goes out and walks around and hangs out in caves and walks through the desert for like 4 days with no food and just water, which can be a little extreme for some people, and definitely not the type of fasting I was looking for. But as he goes through the book, he talks about the different ways of intermittent fasting and other things like that. So maybe you're just fasting from protein for the day. Maybe you're fasting from sugar. Maybe you're fasting from social media. It doesn't have to be just no food, no water for 4, 6, 8 days, whatever. Maybe it's just from 8 p.m. to the night before to 12 p.m. that day, and you're fasting from food and water during that time, or just food, and most of the time you're sleeping, so you're not really you can't really tell that you're fasting, so because you're asleep during most of it. He does suggest, of course, he plugs his bulletproof coffee in there quite a few times, which I'm actually allergic to coffee, so I can't do his bulletproof coffee, but you can do the same thing with tea, and it's basically just to give your body a little bit of something while you're fasting. So it's basically like drinking the water. But he does suggest no bone broth, because that does have protein in it, so then you're not necessarily fasting anymore. So there were some really good tips and tidbits and things like that. But yeah, it was a good book. I gave that 4 stars. And then Hook, Line, and Sinker. I thoroughly was enjoying this book until I had to give the audiobook back, and now I gotta wait until I can get it back in my hands again, because yeah. I didn't plan the timing on listening to that very well. So I got 80% of the way through. It'll probably be a 4-star. It was really good. I actually think I liked it better than the first book in the series, which I read last month, or in August. So you're following the second Bellinger sister and her story throughout, going back to her dad's hometown again to visit her sister, and she meets up with her sister's boyfriend's best friend, who she met when they were there the summer before, and how they are friends, and of course friends to lovers is the trope. So I don't know how it ends yet, so we'll see. I'm assuming I know how it ends, but we'll see what happens. And then I had the most recent purchase, and that was the Elven Heartland. So this is my first foray into Kindle Velas, and it was pretty fun. I didn't really know anything about them, and I was doing the Amazon challenge over the summer, and the only thing I was missing from that challenge was a Kindle Vela. So I went in there and just looked at 3 or 4 and saw one that looked interesting, so I clicked on it. And the first 3 episodes are free, so it's basically like first 3 chapters in this continuing story. And so I read through those. I was like, oh, this is great. this is a super fun one. And then I was like, oh, I need tokens. And then I'm like, wait, I have 500 tokens. How did I get 500 tokens? So what I think happened is when you sign up for Kindle Vella to be able to access them and whatever, you get so many tokens as a gift from Amazon, and then as you're reading through, you get to actually use those to finish your story. I didn't realize there's 83 episodes already available in Elven Heartland. So I didn't get through all of them, but I did get through the first, what they call the first series, which was the first like 25 episodes or chapters. And then the next, when you start the next series, they're free as well. Like the first 3 or 4 chapters were free, so that was great. So I still have over 200 tokens to use. So if you're interested in that, take a look at Kindle Vella. It's pretty cool. And that was my completion for Becca's Bookathon. So I pretty much say I completed it. My punishment for not quite finishing will just be to finish Hook, Line, and Sinker when I get access to it. So the other book club I had was the Full Moon Book Club, and that was The Weight of Blood, and I never did get that from my library, and it's still on hold. It's been on hold for a month and a half, and I'm still the next person in line, so apparently the person ahead of me is just not returning that book. So I've kind of given up on that for now, and we'll pick it up again some other time. Okay, so I also took part of the Witcher Readathon, or Read-Along. September was the last book in this series, which was Season of Storms. And that one, I liked it, but I think I was also kind of like, okay, I'm done with the series, reread the other book, and it kind of had an ending to it, and so now I'm like, now what are we reading? So it took a little bit to get into it. Not my favorite of the books, but it wasn't bad. 3.5 stars, I think, is what I gave that. Yeah, I did enjoy it, but I think it was more me. If I had read it at a different time, I think I would have enjoyed it more. But I was kind of like, oh, I thought we were done with the series, and now I'm trying to get back into it. So it just took me a little bit. By the time I finished the book, I enjoyed it much more than the beginning half of it. So I don't know if it was mainly just me, or if the first part was a little slower, or just kind of like, what's happening here? So 3.5 stars for that. And then I also continued with the Realm of the Elderlings, or the Elderling Along, with the Catch-Up Book Club, and I read actually the last 2 of the Wyld Chronicles books, and I'll get into those when I get into the SeasonAthon Academy readathon. For my TBR jar, I drew The King of Warsaw. That was my book translated from Polish. Didn't really know anything about it going into it, except that there was a dude with boxing gloves on the cover. So again, it was a good book. It felt a little long and slow at points. There was a really interesting twist about 3/4 of the way through or so, and you're like, oh, well, that's interesting. So I did really enjoy that, and I feel like it made the rest of the book worth kind of slogging through it a bit, for lack of a better term. So it made that worth it, because you're like, oh, now I get what's going on. Okay. So basically we're following Jakob, who is kind of like the right-hand guy to, we'll say, like a mob boss, so to speak. And so he's the heavy, and he's the one who goes and beats people up if they don't pay, and that kind of thing. So it's really interesting. So you're in Poland. It's right before World War II hits. You have the Jews and you have the Poles, and they don't always get along, and one side wants more rights than the other, and so it's these two kind of gangs or mobs that are kind of opposing each other, and it was really interesting. I'm glad I read it. Definitely not something I would have picked on my own. But there is a Netflix adaptation TV series for this, which I didn't realize, so that would be interesting. Not necessary for me. I gave it 3.5. Actually, it ended up with 3.5 stars, because I mean, it was written really well, regardless of my enjoyment level of it. The writing was done really well, and the atmosphere was good. You could really feel like you were in that time period and in that area at the time. So And then for my D20 roll, I had Lock and Key, Heaven and Earth. This one was really interesting. I did like this a lot. Okay. So this one we're following the Locke family from a bunch of different time periods. So you have way back when, after the keys had first started being made. And that first story was just so heartwarming. Like, they have a sick child and they're trying to figure out what they can do for this child. And just the way that was handled was just beautiful. There's also some others, so it's kind of following the Locke family through the centuries. And so you get some that are probably in the 60s, 70s time period, and you have some Lockes that are a little more tough than others. So you have, again, you have some mafia time period, like the mob kind of coming through, like it's Al Capone time, and you got some people coming through with that. But it was really interesting in how they used the keys to make it through some of those situations. Say hello to Walter again, everyone. He came back. All right, and then we have my Amazon borrows was the the Venice sketchbook, which I'll get to in SeasonAthon Academy as well. So for SeasonAthon Academy, I went a little extra. So you only had to read 5 books, and then you could take some extracurricular classes. So if you wanted to do more, then you totally could. I ended up doing all of them for some reason because I'm super extra and I just had to go for it. And some of them I did swap out what I had originally chosen for some other ones. Either I couldn't get it from the library, or I found something that fit better, or I found something that was a whole lot shorter that also fit the prompt. So yeah. So SeasonAthon Academy. So my required classes, I took English 1010. I had Read Anything You Want. So for that I read The Bane Chronicles by Cassandra Clare. I did really enjoy this one. I love Magnus Bane. So this one we're following Magnus Bane. We already know who he is, so we're just seeing snippets of his life. So I thought that was great. I liked that it built on some of the things we already knew about him, or gave him built his character up even more by seeing some of the things from his past, and also how they related to the future, and seeing some characters kind of weave in and out from the other stories that we already knew. Super fun. Really liked it. So my next class was Math 1010, and I read Season of Storms for that one, and that's by Andrzej Sapkowski, and that was the last Witcher book. And I think that one really could be read almost anywhere in the series. I don't think it necessarily has to be read last. I think parts of it are probably better if it's read last, but overall, I think I would have enjoyed it better had I read it earlier, if that makes sense. And then History 2850, and that was a colonial Latin America book by a Latin author, and I read A Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo, and that one I enjoyed. I gave it 3 stars, so I really liked it, but I did struggle, so I listened to the audiobook on this one. It was a little hard to get into, but once I kind of got past that, then it was great, and I enjoyed the story. It was interesting. Definitely not anything that I can relate to from my personal life, which is not a problem. That's why I like reading books, because I get to see things from other perspectives and get to see other outlooks that other people have. And then the next class was Philosophy 2210, and that was Intro to Ethics, a book that involves making tough choices. And for that I read City of Dragons by Robin Hobb, and that was the 3rd book in the Wyld Chronicles. I actually really enjoyed this series. I think I enjoyed them more than some people, and I think that's because I've heard a lot of people saying, oh, these aren't as good as some of the other ones, so I had pretty low expectations going in. But I enjoyed getting some of the back history on the area and the dragons, and getting to see things from dragons' perspective and all of that. So I actually really enjoyed it. So we're still following the dragons and their keepers, and figuring out what elderlings are, who they are, and where they used to live, and the different things that they had, to get to learn more about the memory stones and all of that. And again, we're so far deep into the series, you can only say so much. But yeah, I did really enjoy that one. I gave that I think I gave this one 3.5 stars, maybe 4 stars. The last book I did give 4 stars though. So then for foreign language 1020, elementary foreign language 2, read a translated book. And for that I read The King of Warsaw by, Szczepan Twardoch. I think that's how you, not sure how you say it, but I'll make sure I hit the author's names on the screen so you can see it. And that one was translated from the Polish, and again, just talked about that one. So the extra books I read, so we have History 1011, and that was the Venice Sketchbook, and that's by Rhys Bowen. And that one I really enjoyed. It was, so we're following 2 perspectives. We're following Great Aunt Letty, and she is from the 1920s, and we're following her life from her at 18, going to visit Italy and Venice with her aunt, and meeting a boy, of course, and then they move along, never hears from, like, they don't have their contact information, and no way to get in touch with each other, and she comes back years later, and meets him again, and kind of the whole story, their story, Aunt Letty's story, and then her life up until she passes away. And then the other perspective is her great niece, and we follow her as she's suffering through a divorce and thinking her husband's trying to take her child from her, and just some heartbreak for her. And she finally decides, well, her aunt at that time was still alive, so she knew her Aunt Letty. Her aunt passes away and basically tells her to go to Venice and check out the things that she left for her in this box. And so she has to try and figure out what to make of, what is this box? So, like, she gets nothing besides, like, the box, you get the box. So she opens this box, there's some keys and some other things in there, and she's got to figure out what this stuff is for. So she ends up going to Venice and trying to just get away so she can think and figure out what she's going to do now that she's getting a divorce and all of this. And so she then goes to Venice and is trying to puzzle out what is going on with her Aunt Letty. Like, why does she leave her these random things that she knows nothing about? She doesn't know what they're for. And also trying to cope with what she's going to do now that her husband's left her. Is she going to be able to keep her son and things like that? And it's the interaction back and forth between the 2 storylines, and I think that is done really well. So you have chapter headings so you know who you're following, but the 2 timelines follow each other so well, as the great niece is learning about Aunt Letty's life and Aunt Letty actually living that life. And it's World War II, so you still have the concentration camps, you have all, the war happening, and even though Venice was one of the last to get into the war, you still have all of that going on. And so some of that towards the end is a little hard to read, just because of the nature of the war and the things that we know that happened during that time. But it's such a beautiful story. And go on to History 1030, and that's African American history, book by a Black author. And I read Goddess, which is the 7th book in the Rune series, which I already talked about, by Ednah Walters. So there's 10 books in the series, but then there's also now a novella, which comes after Goddess. So there's actually 11 books, so I'm excited to read that extra book in there that I didn't know was coming. So then we have MLNG, so 1050, Knights of the Round Table, book based on Arthurian legend. So for that I read The Winter King by Bernard Cornwell, and that is part of the Warlord Chronicles, the 1st book in the series, and I thoroughly enjoyed this book. The atmosphere and the world building is done so well. I felt completely immersed in the story. And the take on the Arthurian legend was also wonderful. Like, it's not the typical Merlin's there guiding Arthur, and it's not that typical story. we meet Arthur, he already has the sword, so you don't even get any of that part of it in the story. Guinevere and Lancelot are totally different than what you are expecting. It was just a wonderful story, just so well written. I can't wait to get into the rest of the series and read more of Bernard Cornwell's other books, because I really enjoyed his writing style. It really gets you deep and dirty in the mud and the muck of the time period, and just everything. So good. History 2440, and that was the Gilded Age book with foil on the cover, and for that I read Caraval. So this one was an audiobook by Stephanie Garber. I enjoyed that one as well. It was a good fantasy book, super quick and easy to read, but it was really interesting. I enjoyed the game aspect to it, trying to figure out what's real, what's not, or is it real in the moment, but when the game's over, then everything goes back to normal, like trying to figure out some of that stuff. I thought it was very creative. Overall, I think it could have been, it was not the best literary work ever written or anything, but it was very enjoyable. So, thoroughly enjoyed it. I would highly recommend it. And then Philosophy 1110, Applied Critical Thinking, Read a Mystery. And for that, I did The Black Cat by Edgar Allan Poe, which I already talked about. And that one, again, thoroughly enjoyed it. Got the nice dark gothic vibes to it. And I had a class, 3960, Mythology, book based on mythology. So I read Galatea by Madeline Miller. That one was interesting. I didn't get into it as much as I thought I would. It's super short, it's 32 pages, and I didn't know the original story behind it, but I thought it's really interesting, kind of thought-provoking. I would recommend it. I loved Song of Achilles and Circe. I especially loved Circe. That was one of my favorites when I read that one. It's by the same author as those, and so it was done really well. It made me want to read the original just to see what the original storyline was, but they made it more modern day time period. So I would definitely recommend that one. And then Foreign Language 1010, and that one is Elementary Foreign Language 1, book set in a different country. For that I did Kings of the Wyld, which of course set in a whole different world, so definitely different country. Communication 2200, Mass Media History, ebook or audiobook. So for that one I did Fast This Way, and again I already talked about both of those. And then we have History 2450, Depression era, book involving mental health, and for that I read The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. Again, very interesting, thought-provoking, delving into some feminism there, as well as mental health and women of the time period, the things that were just easily dismissed as kind of like the yellow wallpaper, where postpartum depression is a real thing, but back then people didn't really know what that was, didn't think it was a thing, like, oh, you'll be fine, just sleep it off, take it easy for a little bit, that kind of thing, when there really is something going on. And I felt like The Bell Jar had some of that kind of vibes with it too. There are trigger warnings definitely for this book, so I would, if you struggle with trigger warnings, I would definitely look those up before you read this book. But it was definitely out of my comfort zone. Not a type of book I typically read. So moving on now to Philosophy 2010, Intro to Philosophy. Book involves good versus evil. So again, I read that. Lock and Key, Heaven and Earth for that one. There's definitely some really good stories in there, and some where evil comes and tries to get the Locke family, and the Locke family just fights back. Sometimes it's with good, sometimes it's with equal measure of evil. So keep that in mind. History 2820, Modern East Asia, read a book by an Asian author. So I read Crying at H Mart by Michelle Zauner. So I think I got about halfway through this book before I realized it was a memoir. So I've heard a lot of people talk about this book, but not to the point where, like, hey, book is based on somebody's life and they're the author. I really enjoyed this book, and I think once I found out it was a memoir, I enjoyed it even more. There's just so much about it. So my father passed away a few years ago, And so I could really relate to going into some place where you spend a lot of time with that family member, and just going in there makes you tear up or just brings back some memories, and either makes you sad or just makes you glad that you still have those memories. And so some of that kind of, those themes, I really enjoyed, and they really hit home for me. For my dad, he was a baker, and so anytime I go into a bakery or see cinnamon rolls, because that was his big thing, if he did not have cinnamon rolls, there would be riots. So, not literally, but people were not happy. And so whenever I see a bakery that has these cinnamon rolls that looks kind of like my dad's, it makes me think of him and our time together, and the fact that he's not here anymore. So, but yes, Crying in H Mart was really interesting. I really enjoyed her story. Her writing style was really easy to read. I thought it was vulnerable, but yet real at the same time. Wish I could get a little more in depth in more of these books, but with 23, this is already going to be a really long video, so we'll keep moving on. So then Philosophy 2260, Sports Ethics, book involving a sport, and for that I read a comic that a 4-issue comic that I borrowed from a friend, and that was Four Eyes, Hearts of Fire, and this one had a dragon fighting in it, and huge trigger warnings in this one, and I wish I would have actually checked on those a little bit before I got into it, because I went in completely blind. This one did trigger me a little bit, just some animal abuse and some other things like that are in here, some child abuse also, so just be aware of those. But it was really interesting, not really my thing, not sad I read it, but wouldn't really pick up anything else in that series at all. But yeah, you're following a child who's wants to be a dragon fighter and is learning how to train his dragon, and he's being told he needs to train them like everybody else does, which means whips and hitting and that, basically abusing the animal, where he's trying to find a different way to train the animal without causing it harm. So it was really interesting. It was a good series, and I'll just leave it there. So then History 2510, History of Epidemics, book involving a virus, plague, etc. And for that I read Blood of Dragons by Robin Hobb, and that was the 4th book in the Raymond Chronicles. Definitely gave this one 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. Again, can't say a whole lot, as it's the last book in that set of 4, as well as almost the last in the entire series. So that one I did really enjoy. Again, it's not as good as some of her other books, but I really enjoyed them. And then lastly, Philosophy 2350, Popular Culture, book adaptation to movie or TV series, and for that was The Count of Monte Cristo, which again I already talked about. I really enjoyed it. Again, the movie that I watched, the one with Edgar, doesn't really it follows the book in a certain storyline, but the other aspect of it, not so much, which is fine. You got to make it palatable for TV, and for almost 1,500 pages isn't going to cut it with a 2-hour movie. So you got to make some changes, which I totally understand. So, and that was all for my season-a-thon, if you want to see all my books that I read there. And yeah, so I really enjoyed my reading month. I do feel like I'm ready to have a month where I have a few less reads, maybe some longer books. I've had a lot of really short ones, which, I mean, you feel accomplished when you can check those off on your list, like, oh, look, I've read 5 books, but they were all like 30 pages. So I'm excited to get into some longer reads. So my October is full of my 13 spooky reads, and as well as my readathon, other readathons that I'm participating in, like Breath of the Wyld-a-thon and the Haunting of Reader's House. So hopefully November will be maybe just a handful of books and all long ones. So yeah, so that's all I got. It was a lot. Sorry it's so long, but at least you got to meet my dog, Walter. He's great. So again, leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you want to. And thanks for spending time with me. I appreciate it. And I will see you in the comments. Bye.